Welcome to Let's Talk Death, conversations to inform and inspire. Let's Talk Death is a series of conversations with some amazing people from various fields. Our goal through these conversations is to normalize, educate, and demystify the taboo around death, dying, and the journey of grief. Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Mark Anthony. Mark Anthony, psychic explorer, also known as the psychic lawyer, is a fourth-generation psychic medium. He is an Oxford-educated attorney licensed to practice law in Florida, Washington, D.C., and the United States Supreme Court. Mark Anthony travels to mystical locations in remote corners of the world to examine ancient mysteries and supernatural phenomena. Mark appears nationwide on TV and radio, including CBS TV's The Doctors and Gaia TV's Beyond Belief with George Noory. He is the co-host of The Psychic and the Doc on the Transformation Network. He is a featured speaker at conferences, expos, and universities, which include Brown, Columbia, Harvard, and Yale. Mark Anthony is a columnist for Best Holistic Life magazine and the best-selling author of Never Letting Go and Evidence of Eternity. His new book, The Afterlife Frequency, will be released in October of this year. Mark, we are delighted to have you as a guest on Let's Talk Death.
Well, thank you, Andy. I appreciate that. And thank you, Fran, for having me. It's an honor to talk to you.
Yeah, we are thrilled and honored ourselves. Mark, but before we dive into your work, I want to ask, when did you first realize you had psychic abilities? And as a follow-up to that question, what was it like living with psychic parents?
Well, I was about 3.5 years old, and I started talking to my invisible friends, which, you know, at first blush is not odd for a toddler, except for the fact that mom and dad could see who I was talking to, and because both my parents were mediums. And I remember my father was not thrilled. He was like, "Oh God, he's got it." And my mother was like, "Oh God, he's got it," like that. And my parents, it's both of my parents were mediums, and this runs for generations in my family. And the two families could not have been more different. My dad was a Navy SEAL from this very waspy, conservative Pennsylvania family. My mother's family had emigrated from Italy, and the Italians looked at this as, that's a gift from God, you know, and they were real excited about it. And they met after my dad got out of the Navy, and it was kind of a love at first sight. And then after a few chaperoned meetings, because that's how things were done. And, you know, my mother was a good Catholic girl from a proper Italian family. She said, "Look, I got to tell you something." She said, "I see spirits." And my dad goes, "Oh, dear Lord, so do I." And so growing up with psychic parents, you know, when I was a little kid, I didn't think it was weird, but I remember Dad telling me before I go to school, "Don't talk to anyone about this. Talk to your mom and I all you want, but other people won't understand." Well, I caught on pretty quickly. I went to Catholic school, okay? And I thought, okay, well, this will be cool because we have angels and spirits and all. Yeah, going around saying you see dead people when you're 5 years old in Catholic school was not a very bright idea. And so I learned pretty quickly that not everybody's family was like mine. And, you know, it's funny growing up and watching in syndication, the Brady Bunch, I never identified with that. I identified more with, you know, the Addams Family.
I watched both shows. Yeah, great.
That's funny. That's been very funny. So when did you come out of the closet with this gift?
Well, it was always there, and it's funny because when I went public with it, um, all my close friends said, "Yeah, we're not surprised." Okay, everybody just kind of understood that. And when I got out of law school, hold on one second. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I live in the tropics and everything's always pollinating. And in the summer, it's like pollinating on steroids, and I'm doing my best. So I get out of law school and I get a job as a prosecutor for the state of Florida. And so when you're a young prosecutor, they they assign you the first appearances, on weekends and stuff. And so they'd bring all the prisoners in that had been arrested, and I'd have a co-counsel and then the public defender's office at the other table. And I'd be looking at the people before I got the police reports. And I go, oh, okay, that one's a drunk driver. That one looks like a burglary. That one looks like a spouse abuse. That one looks like, and my co-counsel's like, how do you know that? And I'm like, well, look at him. He goes, Mark, they've all been in the drunk tank all night. They all look rough. When you've been arrested and you're in jail all night and you're all grimy and panicked looking. So it kind of got to be this thing at the prosecutor's office. Before we give Mark the file, let's see if he can figure out what they were arrested for. And so it kind of got around that he knows stuff. And so it's always been part of my skill set, particularly when I was selecting juries. I'd be able to get a good connection with people. But what happened, and I think that this ties into very heavily with what Heal Grief does. My mother and I were very close. I had a great relationship with my parents. Yeah, it's just I loved my parents, and they both transitioned now. But when my mother passed, and oh God, I probably get choked up when I tell the story. I remember I was at my law office and I kept thinking I wanted to eat spaghetti. So immediately I called Mom, and she said, oh, I made spaghetti. Why don't you come by for lunch? And their house was only about 5 miles from my office. So I popped in my car, went over, but a beautiful lunch. And I remember laughing and talking with her, but she looked tired. Mom looked tired, and Dad, he seemed to be fine. And before I left, this is one of those things that I'm just so grateful for. She hugged me and kissed me and says, Mark, I love you so much, and I'm so happy that you've been my son. And I'm like, I love you too, Mom. And the next morning, I'm in court, and the judge's assistant came, and I was at the podium, and I just wrapped up what I was doing, and she said, Mr. Anthony, we need you right now. And I was like, uh-oh. And they bring me back into chambers, and it was the call that my mother had passed unexpectedly. Suddenly, her heart gave out in her sleep. And needless to say, I was crushed. And certainly talking to this organization, everybody here can, that feeling when it's like your chest caves in, and then your stomach caves in, and you feel like you're outside of your body, and you're watching this conscious nightmare go by, and you're in this fog, and it's just absolutely horrible. And about 2 weeks after that, I was driving back from court, and how the waves of grief hit you. You'll get some stable points, and then that tsunami, it hits you. Well, one of them hit me when I was driving. I said, okay, this is not good. So I pulled over into this little strip mall, and I figured, all right, let me get my composure. And I was in a parking spot, and suddenly this flash of light goes off. And the thing is, I don't know if it was in the car or in my mind's eye, but I instinctively turned to the passenger side, and I saw the silhouette of my mom in this incredible silver white light. And her voice filled my head. This whole thing took about 5 or 6 seconds. And the voice that I heard was her voice. And she said, Mark, you have been given the gift of mediumship so that you would not be crushed by grief, but now you must help those who are suffering with theirs. And then all of a sudden I break out in a sweat, and I'm sitting there, and I'm like, I was used to seeing spirits, but I wasn't quite expecting anything like that. And so to answer your question directly, Fran, that led me on the path. Within a year of that, I was no longer practicing law. I was working as a medium full time. The door didn't open. It got kicked open and I got shoved through it because that was supposed to be what happened.
Yeah. I tell you, Mark, just listening to you, Fran and I have lots of conversations, obviously, with lots of people. And I've spent decades sitting with people after the death of someone. And it's always touching to me. And I never, it never gets, I never get used to hearing how, after a loss, how that transition even of itself propels people into what they are doing from that point forward. It's like there's their life leading up to the death of a significant person, and then their life after that. And it's that shift. So anyway, thank you for sharing. That was
well, yeah. Thank you, Andy. And and you're never the same after that. And no. When you look into somebody's eyes when you're talking to them seriously, I bet I speak for both of you. You can always tell when somebody's sustained a heavy loss because there's something different about the look in their eyes. And I've had a lot of people say to me, usually younger people, well, I don't know, what you do. I don't know how that would help. I've never lost anybody. And I said, well, enjoy that status while it lasts, because it is going to change and everything in your life will change.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We have this belief at Heal Grief that grief is not something one gets over. It becomes a lifelong companion. And how do you actively move forward with your own life with this companion that you didn't want, that you didn't ask for, but it's there. It's there, and it will always be there. And so when you say, you can see that look in someone's eyes, that companion is always there. The emotions of grief, regardless of years gone by, just sometimes appear with a thought, a smell, a scent, anything.
Exactly. And if you indulge me for a moment,
please.
There was a story. I'm a writer, obviously. I've written 3 books, and I'm a columnist for Best Holistic Life magazine. And I remember years ago, I've had 2 best friends in my life, and both of them have passed. And one of them, his name was Brad. He was my history friend. We used to trade history books. And I remember we went to Central America. We went to Costa Rica together. And we were staying at this hotel along the Pacific coast of the Manuel Antonio National Forest. And it was a beautiful morning. We got up, we drank some Costa Rican coffee, we went down on the beach, and we're going for a jog and a walk, Well, I'm just wearing my swim trunks, and we're walking along this beach, and it's like really, really far. We probably went about 4 or 5 miles, and because it's so absolutely beautiful. Well, we're also not far from the equator, and all of a sudden the storm comes off the Pacific, lightning and all this, and we're like, oh my God, we're on the beach and there's lightning, we got to get out of here. Well, there was nowhere to go except into the jungle. All right, and I'm like, all right, fine. All right, so we're running up towards the jungle, and now I'm like, I'm not wearing any shoes, and I'm running into a Central American rainforest. And so as we're approaching the forest, we hear coming out of it, and I'm like, oh my God. And he's like, what the, and it's like we had both just seen Jurassic Park, and I'm like, which took place in Costa Rica. So we're totally like freaking out, like, what the hell? I mean, what the heck is that? But then lightning burst right above the beach. I said, all right, let's go. So then all of a sudden we're in the jungle and it's dark. And I don't know if anyone's ever been hiking, and I've hiked in a lot of jungles, but wear clothes and shoes. So here I am barefoot, walking through this jungle. I'm getting all cut up, and I'm hearing all this, all around us, and we are terrified, and we're completely lost. And we're thrashing around. I go, and I said, well, maybe we ought to go back out. And Brad grabbed me and says, Mark, there's nothing we can do about that storm. We can't go back. We've got to find our way. And so we kept thrashing around, and then we realized that the sound in the trees above us were howler monkeys who were just as scared of the lightning as we are. And the reason they call them howler monkeys is because they howl. All right. So I'm like, okay, great. And then I'm like, well, what else is in this jungle? I know there's jaguars, which are, lions basically. And so all of a sudden, Brad goes, look, there's a path. So we're going through there. Meanwhile, my feet, I'm filled with thorns and I'm all getting cut up by all the palm fronds and stuff. So we found the small path and we figured, okay, this is kind of in the direction of where we were staying. And then that path led to another path. And meanwhile, it's pouring like a monsoon outside and we're still getting a bit wet, but we got the canopy of the trees. And so that path eventually led to another path. And by the time we got back to the hotel, we were both pretty badly beaten up. My feet were bleeding and all that. And the reason that I bring up this story is I reflected upon it so many times, and it makes so much sense on the journey through grief. Whether you're ready for it or not, it hits you like that monsoon hit me. It came out of nowhere. Yeah. And the next thing we know, we are lost, and it's dark and it's terrifying and we're getting hurt. And you have to find your way. And there's no map. And even though there's wonderful organizations like this and books that I write, it's still your own personal journey. But eventually you're going to find your way, and it isn't easy. And I've always felt that experience was such a wonderful metaphor, because at the time I didn't realize that my best friend one day was going to just suddenly drop dead from an aneurysm. And then that experience came right to me. Yeah. And I think that's what happens to everybody. You get lost in this jungle of grief. And what I really love about the work that healgrief.org does is you offer a path, because as a criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, I've seen a lot of people crushed by grief. And in my last book, Evidence of Eternity, there's a concept in there called grief, crime, grief. And what I would find with a lot of my clients, pretty much most of the drug addicts and alcoholics, is that somewhere in their developmental stages, as a child, young adult, there was an unresolved grief. Sibling, parent, grandparent, even a pet. And not everybody's from families like we are. They're going to sit down and discuss it. They're like, don't worry about it, dude. Don't think about it. Here, smoke this, drink this, snort this. You cannot snort away, smoke away, inject away, party away, have sex away grief. It has to be confronted and dealt with. And it's especially important with children. It's hard enough for adults, but a little kid doesn't have the skill set. And so I found that grief will lead people to engaging in behaviors that end up in criminal behavior. Most drunk drivers that kill somebody, I'd say all of them, didn't say before they started drinking and getting in the car, I think I'll go kill somebody. Okay. Yeah. But it happens. So the grief leads to crime, which inflicts grief. And that's why I so admire the work that you do, because you offer people a path away from that to something which helps you, not only yourself, but others, and to become deeper, more compassionate, more sympathetic to people who are lost in that jungle of grief.
Right. And people who are grieving, especially children and teenagers, they need care and support, not treatment. And that's the other issue is if it's unresolved or a person doesn't have the opportunity to be supported and cared for, it certainly can turn into a pathology. But grief itself isn't a pathology. It's there for us to care for people and support people through it. And that can be done. I know it can be done. I've watched it, happen for many years. That metaphor is, what a wonderful metaphor. That is a great metaphor for grief indeed. I am curious about your new book and wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Afterlife Frequency, and just curious about the book. How is it different from your other books, or even different from other books written by mediums?
This book goes, first off, when I was in law school, I was always suffering through the law books. It's like drinking liquid cement. I mean, it's boring. it's like, oh, and then you get out of law school and you do legal research, and guess what? It's just as boring. And I was always a writer, and I always felt that if I'm going to write a book, I want to educate but entertain. And so as an attorney, I was in criminal law as well as civil law and in head injury litigation. So I've had my whole life, professional life, to work with forensics, physicists, chemists, biologists. I had to work with doctors, head injury specialists, neuroscientists. And so it gave me this background that when I started working with mediumship, I began to see that quantum physics and faith really aren't diametrically opposed, and that there is a logical and rational explanation for everything, and that everything can be explained through physics. And so I took my background as an attorney with all that scientific discipline, plus my dad was a NASA engineer. Okay, so I mean, I grew up with science, and my mom was, being both of them being mediums. Science and spirituality were present always in my house. So that's what I wanted to do, is explain this on a much deeper level than other mediums do, because the problem with mediumship is the understanding of it kind of peaked out during the Victorian era, during the heyday of the spiritualism movement. And the terminology has remained anchored in the 1800s. And the terminology that I started in Evidence of Eternity, but really went forward even more so in the Afterlife Frequency, is bringing this into the 21st century. So I'm not trying to scare anyone when I say it's quantum physics. Trust me, I explain it in a way that anybody can understand it, and then I illustrate it with very fast-moving stories. They could be emotional, gripping, some of them are funny, and that is what makes this book different, because it takes spirit communication out of the shadows of superstition, out of the antiquated terminology of the Victorian era, and brings it into the light of 21st century quantum physics with some humor.
Can you use a term, collective consciousness?
Collective consciousness is fascinating. And the interesting thing is, I believe that pretty much all the great spiritual teachers talked about it. When you hear about Christ consciousness, that is evolving your consciousness to a higher level. You hear about the Hindus talk about Krishna consciousness, and Buddhists, how our consciousness is an eternal stream. What I have found in spirit communication is it's not an individualized thing. A lot of people think that, spirit communication is one spirit per person at a time. Not the case. Think of your brain, think of your soul, which is housed in the brain, as a drop of water. Okay, it's energy, but think of it as a drop of water. And when we physically die, that drop of water plunges into this eternal sea of souls. And that's what I call the collective consciousness. You maintain your individuality, but you're now energetically interconnected with a vast array of other souls. And so during spirit communication, that's why when spirits come through, they're never alone. They'll show up with a whole group of people that'll be connected to you in various ways. And this has been extremely comforting, particularly to parents who've lost children, because what's one of the biggest fears? Is she alone? Not a chance, okay? And I did one reading where for this woman, 24 spirits came through in an hour session. And it was 21 people, 2 dogs, and Rusty the horse came through. And I was like, wow, that's a lot of people that came through for you. And she said, well, I had 11 brothers and sisters, and half of them are on the other side. And then there's my parents, their cousins, and all this. And she goes, and I really loved Rusty the horse, and it's just amazing to know that when we're communicating with the other side, we're communicating with this vast database. And not to belabor the point, of course, I will, because I spend my life studying this. But this is why when a spirit comes through, people tend to think of spirits as just invisible humans with our same limitations. They're not. Because they're part of the collective consciousness, they're patched into this vast database. And that's why in many readings, the spirit will bring up things that far exceeded the scope of anything that he or she knew in this world. I mean, I get spirits coming through. Let's say I'm doing a reading on one of you, and they'll start talking about medical conditions that you or somebody in your family has. Now, maybe Aunt Betty never went to med school, but she sure is patched in, and they'll start giving, I mean, I get these cellular mutations and these weird chromosomal things, and I'll be telling the people this, and they're like, oh my God, that's what I have. That's like, I know. I don't know about those things, but the spirits do. And so that's one of the many benefits of collective consciousness communication, is taking advantage of this infinite knowledge that they're able to transmit to us.
So in the Afterlife Frequency, you also explain the different forms of contact with the spirits. So the collective consciousness, I suspect, is one. Can you go into others?
Well, the collective consciousness is what we're communicating with. The different forms of spirit contact. See, traditionally, mediumship, near-death experiences, deathbed visions, out-of-body experiences, and visitations, where a spirit will come to you, whether or not you're a medium, have all been categorized separately. They're not. They're all involved alignment of the frequency of the soul with the higher vibration of the afterlife frequency, and we get a frequency match. And so that's what I do in the afterlife frequency, is I show the parallels between the different forms of spirit communication. That's why it's all part of human nature. I mean, people have been reporting near-death experiences since the dawn of recorded history, and it baffled people. Somebody would die, and then they'd come back to life. So there was a resurrection, and they start talking about, well, I went through this tunnel into this light. I mean, there's an account that Plato wrote about a soldier, who dies in battle and goes into this transcendent realm in white light, and came back, and he was talking about reincarnation, which is not a part of the ancient Greek, Greco-Roman classical religion. You know, and then you start seeing the similarities with people that have near-death experiences to my contact with, and other mediums' contact with the collective consciousness. So the thing is, spirit communication is a very normal and natural part of being a human, and there's different forms of it, but they're all based on energy and frequency alignment.
I have to ask one more question, because I know your time, we're coming up on time.
Ask away. Hey, this is what I'm doing today. You got me. Okay.
We can go for hours. No. So we hear so many times that people feel as though their person is present, or like your experience was, you saw the shadow of your mother in this light. How do people tap into that? How do people make that connection?
I'm so glad you asked. That's one of the key teaching elements of my new book, The Afterlife Frequency, is what I call the raft technique, where I teach you how to recognize the signs from spirits, accept the contact is real, feel it without fear, and then trust the message. And do we have just a few minutes for how this happened to me?
Please do. I'm sure our audience is going to be thrilled with this.
Well, the raft technique can be applied not just to visitations. It can be applied to interpreting a dream where a spirit comes, which is a visitation, to contact through a medium, through a near-death experience, through a shared death experience, and through a deathbed vision. So it's a technique that works across the board. So I was working on my book, The Afterlife Frequency, and I said, look, not everyone's a medium. Okay, I know there's all these mediums out there. I'll turn you into a medium. Yeah, well, it's like, I can teach you how to play. No, I can't teach you, but somebody can teach me how to play tennis, but I'm not going to be at Wimbledon like ever. Okay, I can pop a ball around, but we can all have a mediumistic and psychic experience, but we're not all mediums. And I'm thinking, well, how do I explain this? And I'm sitting there at my computer, and I'm like, writer's block, that's it. So I said, I'm going for a walk. So I got up and I went outside, and I was going to go to the beach, because I live about a block from the beach. And all of a sudden I did an about face and said, okay, I need to walk along the bike path. There's a bike path nearby. So I'm walking on this bike path, and all of a sudden I see these two objects glowing, shining. And I go over and I see it's a nickel and a penny. And I'm looking at them, and I hear my mom's voice, and I hear her say, if their head's down, don't touch them, it's bad luck. And I started laughing because her family is Italian and they have a superstition for everything, and then I hear my dad's voice saying, it's money, grab it. And I'm laughing. And so I pick up this nickel and this penny, and I'm looking at them in my hand, and I go, oh, 6 cents. And I go, 6 cents. And then I got cold chills and tingles. I said, wait a second, I just heard mom and dad's voice. And then in my mind's eye, filled with an image of my dad standing waist deep in the ocean. And because he was a scuba diver, Navy SEAL, and a swimming instructor at the YMCA. He's taught all these kids how to swim. And I saw him in the water holding this blue canvas raft that he used to have. And I go, raft. And it hit me, recognize, accept, feel, trust. And that's what he did. They maneuvered me to those 2 coins to show me this is the sign. I recognized it. And then he hit me with the raft, accept it, feel, and trust. And I ran back to my computer, writer's block, long gone. And I just started writing, and the words just flew out of my fingers. And it's like, and that's how the raft technique came. And I've been sharing it with people who find it very, very helpful.
Well, Mark, this has been a fascinating conversation. I tell you, you say that there's stories in your book, and some of them are serious and some of them are humorous. I think you have a good mix of both. So this has been it really has been an enjoyable conversation. Appreciate you coming on with us. We're about out of time, but we do want to give you just a minute to let people know how they can connect with your work, with you. How might they go about doing that?
Absolutely. My website is afterlifefrequency.com, just like my book, Afterlife Frequency. And I'm inviting everyone to sign up for my newsletter so you can find out my upcoming episodes of The Psychic and the Doc, and also other things that I'll be doing, spirit communication events. You can order my book, The Afterlife Frequency. You can also find out about signing up for a one-on-one session with me, because readings on the phone are just as accurate as in person, because everything is electromagnetic energy that moves at the speed of light. And you can find all of that at afterlifefrequency.com. And Fran and Andy, I really want to thank you for having me on this podcast. Coping with death, it is a road nobody wants to take, but unfortunately it's one we're all shoved down at some point in life. And let me tell you something, having an open-minded forum like this makes all the difference in the world.
Thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate you. We appreciate the work you do. I'm sure you bring quite a bit of closure to some very, very deep grief. So thank you for that, and for being a guest here on Let's Talk Death, and for sharing your story behind you.
Thank you.
And thank you to those who joined us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
And if you know of a bereaved adult, refer them to our AMF app, where adults of all ages connect with others experiencing a similar death loss. And last, make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links of future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
And so with that, again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.